Delve is a keyword mechanic where you can pay for spells by exiling cards from a graveyard, each card you exile paying for 1 mana. This is a very strong mechanic, and every card with the keyword has made sure to have its mana cost bumped up to accommodate just how much of a discount this could give you. So today we're going to go over some of the worst cards that have ever been given this really good Delve mechanic. And at number 10, we have Adrift. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 5 and 1 blue. It has Delve, and it has the effect where you put target non-land permanent on top of its owner's library. Most of the cards of the Delve mechanic follow this kind of formula. You take a pretty normal effect and add a ton of colorless mana to the cost. There are tons of other cards with a very similar effect to Adrift. For example, Time Ebb, which is also a sorcery and costs 3 mana. While the card costs twice as much as Ebb, if you can manage to delve a measly 3 cards, you have a strictly better card, as it can target more card types. Delving 3 cards is pretty easy, and it's not all that hard to delve more than that. The biggest issue with the card was just that the effect wasn't quite good enough. Delving away cards is still a resource, and it does take some effort to get the cards into the graveyard. As a result, delve cards are often in competition with each other for slots and usually only want to be played in certain decks. On top of all this, while Adrift could be strong and versatile removal, putting a card back on top of someone's deck where they would draw it next turn wasn't always what you wanted to do. Sometimes you do really need a card gone for good. For example, if your opponent is playing stacks cards and you need to permanently out the lock. Of course, it could be extremely powerful in other situations, such as getting rid of an early threat and essentially blinking your opponent's draw step. This has made Adrift a really niche card, as its many upsides and downsides have let it find a very few specific homes. The biggest one is blue-black mill in formats like Modern. One card these decks would often play was Mesmeric Orb, a 2-mana artifact that makes a player mill a card whenever a permanent they control becomes untapped. This card was amazing with Adrift, as it did 2 huge things for the card. First, it filled your graveyard fast, making Adrift extremely cheap. Secondly, it made your opponent mill cards during their upkeep before they got to draw almost every turn, meaning any card you put on top of their deck with Adrift would be gone forever. This let the card find a home in certain metagames, though blue-black mill has fallen out of favor as Modern has gotten more powerful. Now, a card like Adrift usually wouldn't make a worse list, but most of the Delve cards were at least okay, if not pretty good in some formats. This really just goes to show how intrinsically strong the mechanic is, that even one of the 10 worst cards with it still found competitive success. And at number 9, we have Sultai Scavenger. This is a 3/3 bird warrior with a mana cost of 5 and 1 black. It has Delve and Flying, meaning it can't be blocked except by creatures with Flying. This is one of several creatures with Delve, and these cards have had a pretty good track record. You never really want to cast this for anything more than 2 mana, so you'll need to have at least 4 cards in your graveyard to cast the card for a good rate. This is pretty difficult to do, but not impossible. Getting it for 1 mana is an even better deal. However, Scavenger has some stiff competition to contend for. For example, Delver of Secrets is a 1-mana creature that you can transform into a 3/2 with Flying if you have an instant or sorcery on top of your library at the beginning of your upkeep. Delver is legal in pretty much every format and has had some success in most of them. All the cards ask you to do is play a good number of instant and sorcery cards, which is a lot easier than getting enough cards into graveyard to delve for Scavenger. On the other hand, there are also cards like Hooting Mandrills and Gurmag Angler, delve cards with a similar cost but much larger stat lines. They don't have Flying, which is a downside, but the extra stats matters a lot, especially since they break into the ever so important 4 toughness threshold that lets them survive lightning bolts in a lot of formats. Scavenger has seen a bit of play in Pauper, a format where only common cards are legal, but it's usually just outclassed by Gurmag Angler. And at number 8, we have Empty the Pits. This is an instant with a mana cost of XX, meaning any amount of mana twice and 4 black. It has Delve and has the effect where you create X tapped 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. Empty the Pits is one of the most powerful but least practical cards on this list. The card doesn't really scale that well. To make 3 zombies, you'll need to pay 6 mana for the X's in the costs, which would require delving away 6 cards and paying 4 black mana. This is pretty hard to pull off, and the payoff really isn't worth it. 4 mana for 6 power is good, but it's not necessarily impressive. Now, you can obviously make the card a lot better than that by really focusing on milling yourself, but that's a lot of work for a pretty small drink of water. There were a few issues with trying to mill as many cards as you can to try to make a huge Empty the Pits, but they mostly came down to the fact that there were just far better things to be doing, and it just wasn't quite capable of keeping up with other decks could do. In older formats, there were just far better things to do if you could mill a huge number of cards. Usually cards that only need to be in your graveyard for you to get their effects. So trying to mill a ton of cards, draw an empty, and then pay 4 black mana to cast it was just a terrible plan that wasn't really worth it versus similar other strategies. That only really leaves it to run through Standard, where it also underperformed. Filling your graveyard is more difficult in lower power formats, just like most other strategies, so Empty took a lot longer to get rolling. You couldn't afford to wait too long though, since aggro mid-range decks would roll over you in no time. This made Iason as a combo fairly weak, so the only real role the card could try to fill was as a control finisher, where it was also easily outclassed by the likes of Pearl Lake Ancient and Dragon Lord Ojutai. In the end, Empty the Pits is just too clunky, requiring a steep 4-colored mana to cast and needing you to mill far too many cards to scale to the point of ever being worth casting. Empty is the last card on this list that really saw any competitive success, as a few standard decks did at least put up decent results using the card. And at number 7, we have Death Rattle. This is an instant with a mana cost of 5 and 1 black. It has Delve and has the effect where you destroy target non-green creature, and that creature can't be regenerated. This is a pretty weak removal spell. Having to hit non-green creatures makes it far less useful than it would be otherwise, and the extra upside of stopping regeneration might as well be flavor text for how infrequently the mechanic appears. This card costs too much for the rather simple effect to destroy a creature. The running rate for creature destruction is 3 mana without a downside, and you have to exile at least 4 cards from your graveyard to beat this rate. This was difficult enough that the card wouldn't consistently be a better murder, and wouldn't be online fast enough. Delve makes almost any card it's on at least okay, but the card has been beaten out by other removal spells at basically every point it's been in existence. Interestingly, there's a very similar card that has actually been at least fairly successful. Murderous Cut is an instant that costs 4 and 1 black, has Delve, and destroys target creature. This card actually consistently saw play back in its standard format. Costing only 1 less mana and being able to hit green creatures ended up making a huge difference. And Cut is even seen play in Pioneer in various black decks. Simply removing the restriction and knocking 1 mana off the cost was enough to make this card very strong, but Death Rattle itself never found any success. And at number 6, we have Dead Drop. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 9 and 1 black. It has Delve, and it has the effect where target player sacrifices 2 creatures. Edict effects, as they're called, are usually somewhat niche. They're most often used to out specific threats that are usually harder to answer. For example, cards that can regenerate or have hexproof, for example. Thrun, the Last Troll, can often be difficult or should have been impossible to answer with traditional removal spells. Edicts can get around basically all of this, as they both neither target nor destroy your opponent's creatures. And of course, hitting 2 creatures makes it give you even more value and makes it better in more situations, as it's more likely to kill whatever creature you're trying to get rid of. Now, the reason this card ended up being pretty bad is a combination of being far too niche and far too expensive. Delving so many cards away to be able to cast this for a low mana value was usually pretty impractical, especially considering that by the time you could do that, you could simply cast a board wipe instead. There weren't really any targets that you would want to make your opponent sacrifice, but that a board wipe wouldn't also be able to answer a round in standard at that point. Not to mention, you kind of wanted your opponent to have exactly 2 creatures when you cast this card. If they had only 1, you weren't really getting the value you needed off of it. If they had more than 2, you would miss or kill the most important threat. Dead Drop's success was also more directly sabotaged by Murderous Cut, as they were both in the same standard together. Cut was way easier to use in far more situations than Dead Drop was, and with how Delve cards would fight for space in decks, basically every deck would play Cut above Drop every time. And at number 5, we have Shambling Attendants. This is a 3/5 zombie with a mana cost of 7 and 1 black. It has Delve and Death Touch, meaning any amount of damage this card deals to another creature is enough to destroy it. This is one of the worst Delve threats out there. It compares disfavorably to basically every other creature with Delve with only one exception. Hooting Mandrills costs less and is a 4/4 with trample, meaning it can deal excess combo damage to a defending player when attacking. This is generally better, as these Delve threats were usually used as a late or mid-game threat, so you would normally want them to be better at attacking rather than good at blocking. Hitting this home even more is the comparison to Gurmag Angler, which costs 1 less mana and is just a vanilla 5/5. This stat line is basically just always better, as not only can it kill your opponent more quickly, but it would basically always kill any creature in any combat. Even Sultai Scavenger, another fairly weak Delve threat, at least has evasion, letting it fill a different role from some of the other Delve cards. Basically, Attendants was a worse body than basically every other Delve creature, but costs more to cast as well, making it extremely hard to use at all. And at number 4, we have Sibsig Muckdraggers. This is a 3/6 zombie with a mana cost of 8 and 1 black. It has Delve and the ability where, whenever it enters a battlefield, you return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is the last Delve creature on this list, and it's worth going over why I put it above Shambling Attendants. You see, in a vacuum, Muckdraggers is the stronger card, as it can get you a 2-for-1 fairly easily. The Gravedigger effect is generally a lot stronger than Death Touch. However, Magic isn't played in a vacuum, and the formats that the cards are legal in makes a big difference. You see, Attendants is legal in Pauper, a non-rotating format that only has commons in it, whereas Muckdraggers, being an uncommon, was only legal in the more normal constructed formats. This means that, within the context of the formats I would see play in, Attendants was the stronger card. You could argue about the best way to evaluate this, but this is the order we've landed on. Anyway, Muckdraggers is a strange card, as it's sort of going against itself. You see, Muckdraggers wants you to have creatures in your graveyard to bring back, but also wants to exile creatures from your graveyard to make it cheaper. The play you'd want to do is play Muckdraggers for 1 black mana, exiling a bunch of cards from your graveyard, get a creature back, and then cast that creature. But to do that, you need to have at least 9 cards in your graveyard. This leads to a lot of situations where you can't both cast your Muckdraggers for cheap enough and get the creature you want back at the same time. Compare this to Tasigur the Golden Fang, which is a delve threat with the ability where you can pay 4 mana to mill 2, then have target opponent choose a non-land card in your graveyard and return it to your hand. Tasigur's ability to recur cards from your graveyard actually synergizes with Delve, as you can exile all the cards you don't want back and then force your opponent to give you better cards. This made slamming Tasigur quickly far stronger than trying to play Muckdraggers. Not to mention that it has a stat line that was usually better as well. All in all, Muckdraggers was just far too hard to actually use. And at number 3, we have Tasigur's Cruelty. This is a sorcery at the mana cost of 5 and 1 black. It has Delve and the effect where each opponent discards 2 cards. This is basically just a version of Mind Rot with Delve. Now, discard is one of the more interesting effects in Magic. It can be extremely powerful. So powerful, in fact, that a single Thoughtseize can win you the game on the spot. While this effect can be extremely good, top decking a discard spell late into the game is pretty terrible. In the mid to late game, your opponent will have already played most of their cards, have things like counter magic up to protect their hand, have some kind of value engine to be able to recover from it, or any number of situations that make it so that discarding cards from their hand won't disrupt their game plan anymore. Basically, the earlier you are in the game, the better the effect is. And this is why Cruelty is such a miss of a card. Delve cards are best in the mid to late game after players have cast a number of cards and have graveyards that have started to get filled up naturally. Casting Cruelty on turn 2 or 3 is extremely difficult, and even if you can, it won't really be worth it. You'll probably have to use a full card to mill yourself, spending a card and mana to set up your graveyard, and at that point you could Cruelty to rip the worst 2 cards out of your opponent's hand, but that doesn't really accomplish much. Since you used a card to set up your graveyard already, you won't even be getting card advantage. So you'll basically just be spending mana to drain both players' resources while your opponent actually gets to develop their game plan. The card was simply way too slow for a discard spell. And at number 2, we have Rite of Undoing. This is an instant with a mana cost of 4 and 1 blue. It has Delve, and it has the effect where you return target non-land permanent you control and target non-land permanent you don't control to their owner's hands. Bouncing is an effect that's pretty limited in its usefulness. The card disadvantage inherently in these cards can be really crippling in longer games. The main upside is the tempo swing they give you by forcing your opponent to replay their cards. However, Rite requires you to bounce one of your own cards, meaning that the use case of the card goes way down. For the card to be any good, you need to be in a situation where there are cards you want to bounce on board and cards your opponent controls that they don't want returned to their hand. This would usually be accomplished by using cards with enter or leaves the battlefield effects that bouncing would let you use again for additional value. This can occasionally happen, but it's a very niche situation. Rite makes these spots even less likely, as you also need to have enough cards in your graveyard to delve away. Sure, getting cards in your graveyard is pretty easy, but it's still a hurdle that makes it less likely you'll be able to use Rite effectively. Not to mention that most bounce spells are only priced at 2 mana, so you're not even really getting much of a discount for using it as a delve spell. All this together makes Rite of Undoing a very clunky card without enough of a payoff. And at number 1, we have Will of the Naga. This is an instant with a mana cost of 4 and 2 blue. It has Delve and has the effect where you tap up to 2 target creatures, and those target creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap step. Now, this is the first card on this list that really strikes me as just being kind of terrible. Delve is a very strong keyword, and if you're able to mill yourself enough, almost any effect will be at least passable. Even underwhelming vanilla creatures are at least serviceable. However, Will the Naga has such an underwhelming effect that I can't imagine a time any deck would want to play it. These types of freezing effects are often pretty bad everywhere outside of Limited. The card disadvantage inherent to the design is very difficult to overcome. Spells like Sleep have occasionally seen play in blue temple decks in Standard while in rotation to allow for big attacks, but often in sideboards. Only freezing 2 creatures is usually not quite impactful enough to want to spend an entire card on. Delving cards away to cast it for only 2 mana doesn't really do enough to save it. It's also one of the few delve cards with multiple colored mana pips at its cost, so you can't even cast it for only 1 mana. This seems like a weird choice, as there are very few delve cards with multiple pips, and it's a strict nerf to the strength of the card. It seems like Wizards seem to think this card would legitimately be too strong in the limited environment otherwise, which seems a bit unlikely. Will the Naga is one of the few delve cards that I can say would be legitimately bad in basically every deck, with basically no niche whatsoever. Alright, and that's the list. I think there are any other cards we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.